The Galactic Council said humans needed protection. The human envoy asked, from whom? The transmission arrived at 0312 hours while I was still asleep. I know the exact time because my bunk light snapped on automatically, the way it always does when a Priority 1 signal cuts through standard blackout protocol. 3 years as Earth's senior diplomatic envoy, and I had learned to read the color of that light before I even opened my eyes. White meant routine. Amber meant urgent. Red meant something had gone wrong somewhere in the galaxy and someone had decided it was my problem to fix. The light was red. I sat up, pulled the data slate off the charging pad beside my bunk, and read the header twice. Not because I misunderstood it. Because I wanted to be absolutely certain I was reading it correctly before I let myself feel anything about it. Galactic Council, Priority Designation, Alpha. Recipient, Ambassador Kale Morrow, Earth Diplomatic Mission, Vethra Approach Corridor. Subject, Formal Invitation, Protective Status Hearing, Session 7714. I set the slate down. I picked it back up. The Galactic Council did not send invitations. They sent summons dressed up in polite language so that no one had to feel like they were being dragged anywhere. I had seen enough of their correspondence over the years to know the difference between a request and an order wrapped in courteous phrasing. This was the second kind. Protective status. I had read about it in the academic records back during my training on Earth. It was a designation the Council applied to young species, ones they considered too volatile, too underdeveloped, or too dangerous to themselves to be allowed full sovereign participation in galactic affairs. On paper it sounded like a kindness. The Council would assign advisors, provide infrastructure support, manage diplomatic relations on the protected species' behalf until they were deemed ready to handle such things themselves. In practice, every species that had ever received a protective designation was still waiting to have it removed. Some had been waiting for 400 years. I dressed quickly, splashed cold water on my face, and walked the short corridor from my quarters to the communications bay of the shuttle. My pilot, a quiet man named Alan Ford who had been flying diplomatic craft for 11 years and had the calm eyes of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by anything, was already awake. He was sitting with a cup of something warm, reading the same transmission on his own screen. He looked up when I entered. They sent an escort, he said. I saw 2 Vihari dreadnoughts. I poured myself a cup of the same warm drink. It was a grain-based blend that tasted faintly of burned wood and required 3 years of daily consumption before you stopped noticing, and sat down across from him. Through the forward viewport, I could see them. 2 Vihari ships, enormous and angular, hanging in space off our port side like a pair of patient mountains. Each one was roughly the size of a city district back home. Each one was armed well enough to remove a small moon from the political map. They had sent all of that to escort a single diplomatic shuttle carrying 1 man and his pilot. They're worried about something, Alan said. Yes, I agreed. Are you worried? I thought about that honestly. The honest answer was that I felt something closer to curiosity than worry. The Vihari were one of the Council's primary enforcement arms, large, disciplined, and not known for subtlety. Sending 2 of their dreadnoughts to escort a single unarmed shuttle was not a security measure. It was a statement. They wanted me to arrive at Vethra Station already feeling small. I had been to Vethra before. I knew what the chamber looked like, how the lighting was arranged to make the Council members appear elevated and the visitor appear diminished. I knew that the seating configuration placed the speaker at the center of a curved room designed so that every angle made you feel surrounded. It was all theater. Impressive theater, but theater nonetheless. Not particularly, I said. Alan nodded and went back to his drink. I pulled up the full Council file on my slate and began to read. The document was long. It had clearly been prepared over several months, which meant this had been planned well before the transmission arrived on my desk. Someone on the Council had been building a case for human protective designation for a significant period of time, gathering data, constructing arguments, organizing votes. The transmission I received was not the beginning of this process. It was the end of it. I was being invited to a hearing whose conclusion had likely already been decided. That did not concern me as much as it might have concerned someone else. Decisions that have already been made can be unmade, if you arrive with the right information and the right posture. I read through the threat assessment section. It was the most interesting part. The Council's analysts had compiled a detailed profile of humanity, our history, our conflicts, our technological development, our rate of expansion since achieving faster-than-light travel. They had catalogued every military incident in human history with meticulous care. They had noted our casualty rates in various conflicts, our resource consumption, our population growth curve. At the bottom of the threat assessment, they had assigned us a classification. Level 4 hazard. Unpredictable. Emotionally volatile. Strategically capable beyond expected developmental parameters. I read that last phrase 3 times. Strategically capable beyond expected developmental parameters. It was the most carefully worded compliment I had ever received in a document that was trying very hard not to sound like a compliment. I closed the file and looked out at the 2 dreadnoughts keeping pace with us through the dark. They had sent 2 city-sized warships to escort a diplomat carrying a data slate and a grain blend beverage. I made a mental note of that. The note simply read, "They are afraid of something. Figure out what." Alan's voice came from the pilot's seat. 14 hours to Vethera approach. Thank you. I leaned back and began to think through what I knew. The council was made up of 7 species. The Vihari, the Orathi, the Kolthari, the Theshan Collective, the Brek, the Lorvani, and the Ven. Each species had its own interests, its own economic dependencies, its own reasons for wanting the galaxy arranged in a particular way. A unanimous vote for human protective designation, which the transmission implied, meant all 7 had agreed, which was unusual. The council did not agree unanimously on very much. That level of agreement required either a genuine, shared fear, or a great deal of behind-the-scenes negotiation by someone with an agenda that benefited every party. I needed to know which of those it was. I finished my drink. I picked up my slate again and opened a blank document. At the top I wrote a single line, "What does the council gain from placing humanity under designation?" Then I began to answer my own question, working through the economics, the territory maps, the trade routes, and the political alignments, one careful line at a time. Outside, the 2 dreadnoughts kept their silent watch. 14 hours was enough time to build a case. I intended to use every minute of it. The corridor outside my quarters was dim and the station made a low, constant sound like the hum of a vast machine breathing, which, in a sense, it was. Vethera Station was old. Older than several of the species currently seated on its council. The walls were layered with centuries of renovation over renovation, each civilization that had governed the station leaving its own aesthetic choices behind like geological strata. You could read the political history of the Galactic Council just by looking at which hallway you were walking through. I had slept 4 hours. I was dressed in my formal diplomatic attire, a dark, structured jacket with Earth seal on the left chest, simple trousers, polished shoes. No medals. No decorative insignia. No indication of military rank or affiliation, because I had none. I was a civilian diplomat, and I had always believed that arriving to a negotiation dressed for a conflict told your opponent something about your confidence level that you probably did not want them to know. The hearing chamber was on level 9 of the station's administrative spine. I walked there alone. I had been offered a station escort, 3 uniformed Vihari attendants who would have guided me through the correct corridors and arrived at the chamber doors precisely on schedule. I had declined politely and found my own way, which took me through 2 wrong turns and 1 detour through what appeared to be a maintenance corridor that smelled strongly of something metallic and warm. I arrived at the chamber doors 2 minutes early. The doors were tall, several meters of dark composite material engraved with the council's emblem, a 7-pointed arrangement of interlocking shapes, each point representing 1 member species. I stood and looked at them for both of those minutes. Not because I was nervous. Because I wanted to be completely calm when I walked through them. There is a difference between entering a room composed and entering a room serene. I wanted the second thing. Serenity does not perform. It simply is. The doors opened. The chamber was exactly as I remembered it from my one previous visit, 4 years earlier, when I had attended as a junior observer during trade corridor negotiations. Curved walls rising to a high ceiling. Soft, directional lighting that bathed the council's raised crescent seating in a warm, authoritative glow and left the speaking floor noticeably cooler and dimmer. 7 seats, 7 species, 7 pairs of eyes tracking me as I walked to the central speaking position. I placed my data slate on the small podium. I looked up. High Arbiter Thesivane was seated at the center of the crescent. Thesivane was old, by any measurement, older than most recorded diplomatic agreements between the council and newer species. Their species, the Theshan Collective, communicated through a combination of subsonic resonance and carefully modulated color shifts in their external membrane. The translation technology built into the chamber systems converted this into spoken language in real time, and the voice that came out was always the same, measured, careful, and carrying the particular quality of someone who had been patient for so long that patience had become indistinguishable from indifference. Ambassador Morrow, Thesivane said. We appreciate your prompt arrival. Thank you for the escort, I said. The Vihari pilots are very professional. A small shift in the chamber. Not quite silence, the ambient hum of the station continued, but a shift in the quality of attention in the room. Several council members exchanged looks that I catalogued quickly. The Orathi representative, a large, heavily built figure named Councillor Vreth, turned its head very slightly. The Kolthari delegate, a thin individual I did not yet have a name for, adjusted something on the surface of their console. Thesivane continued without acknowledging my remark. You have been called before this body to receive formal notification of Resolution 7714 regarding the provisional protective designation of the human species as registered under the terms of the Concord of Civilizations, Article 42, Subsection 9. I am familiar with the resolution, I said. Then you understand that this designation is offered in the spirit of guidance and protection, I said. Yes. I read the full document on the way here. Another small shift. Thesivane's membrane shifted through a shade I did not have a translation for. The chamber system rendered it as a pause. Very good, Thesivane said. Then you will also understand that the council has voted, and the vote was unanimous. I noticed that, I said. Unanimous votes are rare. It made me curious. It reflects the depth of the council's concern for humanity's well-being. I looked at Thesivane for a moment. Then I looked at each of the other 6 council members in turn, slowly enough that each of them knew they had been looked at. Then I looked back at Thesivane. High Arbiter, I said, I have one question before we proceed, if the council permits. You may speak. Protection, I said, from whom? The chamber went quiet in a way that was different from the quiet before. The ambient hum of the station was still there, but the human sounds, the subtle shifts of bodies in seats, the small movements of hands on console surfaces, all of that stopped. 7 pairs of eyes, or what passed for eyes among each species, were on me. The galaxy, Thesivane said after a moment, contains many dangers. The Kroth Expanse. Void nomad migration corridors. Stellar instability zones. Younger species require. I have here, I said, lifting my data slate, the Council's own intelligence reports, filed between 11 and 34 years ago, regarding humanity's contact with the Kroth Expanse. I turned the slate to face the Council and read from it. Not the summary. The actual field reports. 3 of them, each one compiled by Council observers who had been monitoring human space without our knowledge, which I noted was itself an interesting fact worth addressing at another time, and each one documenting an encounter between human vessels and Kroth territory incursions. The 3rd report ended with a single line that I read aloud carefully. Kroth expansion into sectors 7 through 11 has ceased. Cause, unknown. Human activity in region, confirmed. I set the slate down. The cause is not unknown, I said. The cause is simply that no one asked us. Councillor Vreth of the Orathi was absolutely still. I had read about the Orathi. Their stillness, unlike that of many species, was not a sign of discomfort. It was a sign of complete attention. Vreth was listening to every word with every part of its considerable focus. The void nomads, I continued, last made significant movement into inhabited space 14 years ago. The Council's response, I understand, was a diplomatic mission that achieved partial success. Humanity's response was different. I won't detail it here unless asked. But I will point out that void nomad activity in any human-adjacent sector has been at 0 for the past 11 years. Ambassador, said the Kolthari delegate, in a tone that suggested they had prepared for this moment, these incidents, whatever their outcome, demonstrate exactly the concern the Council has raised. Humanity's approach to these situations is effective, I said. Unpredictable, the delegate said. Those 2 words are not opposites, I said. They're sometimes the same thing. The Kolthari delegate closed their mouth. I pulled up one more file on my slate. I did not read from it yet. I held it and looked at the Council with an expression that I had spent many years calibrating, not aggressive, not submissive, but occupying the particular register of calm that communicates, without a single word, that the person holding it is not going anywhere and is not going to become easier to deal with by being made to feel small. I would like to invoke Article 7 of the Concord of Equals, I said. The silence this time was longer. Article 7 was old. Older than half the species currently serving on the Council. It was a clause written into the founding Concord by a civilization that no longer existed, the precursor species that had built Vethra Station in the first place. Article 7 granted any recognized sentient species appearing before the Council the right to a formal counterpresentation period of no fewer than 72 hours before any designation could be formalized. It had not been invoked in over 200 years. Most of the Council's current legal staff had probably never read it. "You are familiar with Article 7, Thesivane said. It was not quite a question. "I'm a thorough reader," I said. Thesivane's membrane moved through several shades. The Chamber's translation system rendered the pause as silence. "The Council will recess," Thesivane said finally. 72 hours, as the Concord requires. Ambassador Morrow, you will be provided quarters aboard the station." "Thank you," I said. I picked up my data slate, turned, and walked back to the chamber doors. I did not hurry. I did not look back. Behind me, I could feel the attention of 7 species following me out of the room. In my quarters, 2 hours later, with a fresh cup of the burntwood-tasting grain blend steaming beside me, I opened a secure channel to Earth. The signal delay was manageable, just under 4 minutes each way. I requested 3 things. First, Dr. Caroline Briggs, the leading expert in galactic economic dependency structures, currently teaching at the University of Edinburgh. Second, Owen Harley, a retired intelligence analyst who had spent 30 years compiling humanity's off-the-record contact history, the incidents that never made it into the official files sent to the Council. Third, a document that had been locked in the Xenodiplomacy archive since before I was born. A psychological profile of the Galactic Council's decision-making patterns, compiled by a woman named Dr. Nora Lane, who had spent 40 years studying alien governance before most of humanity knew aliens existed. The response came back 8 minutes later. All 3 were available. Dr. Briggs and Owen Harley would be on a fast shuttle within 6 hours. Dr. Lane's document would be transmitted immediately. I opened the document while I waited. The first line read, "They do not fear what they understand. They fear what they cannot predict. Make yourself legible only up to the point where legibility becomes limitation." I read that line twice. Then I started planning the next 72 hours. 72 hours is not very much time when you are trying to build a case that might determine the future of your entire species. It is, however, more than enough time if you have the right people helping you and if you know exactly what you are trying to prove. Dr. Caroline Briggs arrived 8 hours after my request. She was a compact, sharp-eyed woman in her late 50s who carried 3 bags of data storage and immediately asked me where the best working surface in my quarters was. I pointed her to the long desk by the viewport. She sat down and started working before I had finished my sentence. She did not make small talk. I liked her immediately. Owen Harley arrived 4 hours after her. He was older, somewhere in his early 70s, with the kind of patient face that comes from a life of careful observation and very few unnecessary words. He carried 1 bag. It contained, he told me, everything I needed to know about what humanity had actually done in the galaxy over the past 60 years, as opposed to what the official record showed. "How much of it is in the Council's intelligence files?" I asked. "Maybe 40%, he said. "And the 40% they have is the boring 40%. We set up in the main room of my quarters, the 3 of us. Dr. Briggs handled the economics. Owen handled the operational history. I handled the political structure and Dr. Lane's framework for reading the Council's psychology. What emerged over the next 48 hours was not what I had expected. I had gone into the process thinking I would find evidence that the Council's concerns were exaggerated, that humanity's history had been misread and I needed to correct the record. What I found instead was considerably more interesting. The Council was not wrong about what humanity was. They were wrong about what that meant. Every incident Owen walked me through, every quiet resolution of a galactic-level problem that never made the formal record, told the same story. Humanity, when it encountered something threatening, did not wait for permission. It did not file a report and request guidance. It assessed the situation, made a decision, and acted. Sometimes those actions were loud. Sometimes they were invisible. The results, however, were consistent. Caroline laid out the economic picture with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades making complex systems comprehensible. The Galactic Council's protective designation structure was, at its core, a dependency model. Species under designation did not develop their own diplomatic networks, their own trade agreements, or their own defensive capabilities. They became permanent clients of the Council's member species, buying their protection, their infrastructure, their representation. The Kolthari, as it turned out, had 11 designated species currently providing them with exclusive resource extraction rights. The Vihari had 7. Even the Lorvani, the most quietly spoken of the Council members, held controlling advisory positions over 4 designated worlds. It was not malicious, exactly. It was simply how power maintained itself. You found something that worked, and you built a system around it, and the system became its own justification. And humanity doesn't fit the model, I said. Humanity breaks the model, Caroline said. You can't make a species dependent on your protection if they've already handled every threat you were going to protect them from. I sat with that for a long time. Then I thought about the young Vihari attaché who had stopped me in the station corridor the previous evening. Her name, she had told me, was Vale, a junior staffer, clearly new to her posting. She had approached me hesitantly, and I had expected another quiet probing conversation designed to find out where my limits were. Instead, she had asked me something genuinely personal. What are humans afraid of? She said. The reports describe your species as fearless, but I don't think that's accurate. Every species fears something. I had thought about it honestly. It was not a question I had been asked before, not in those terms. Stagnation, I told her. Being contained. Dying without having moved forward. We're afraid of being stopped, not physically, but in terms of what we could become. She had looked at me with an expression I could not fully read, something between recognition and unease. That is a very unusual thing to be afraid of, she said. Maybe, I said. But it means we keep moving. And moving solves a lot of problems that waiting around only makes worse. She left without responding. I watched her go and thought that she would think about that conversation for a while. Back in my quarters, with 30 hours left before the counter-presentation, I put everything together. The compact I was drafting was not a refusal. It was not a challenge to the Council's authority. It was an offer. Humanity's 70 years of unrecorded problem-solving, made formal. Our knowledge of the Kroth. Our understanding of void nomad movement patterns. Our assessment of the stellar instability zones that the Council's models were, based on Owen's files, significantly underestimating. All of it, organized, documented, and offered to the Galactic Council as the contribution of a full sovereign partner rather than the liability of a dependent ward. In exchange, full recognition. No designation. A seat at every table that made decisions affecting human space. The compact was 12 pages. I wrote and rewrote it until every sentence was as clear and as clean as I could make it. Simple language. No rhetorical flourishes. No emotional appeals. Just the facts, arranged in an order that made a single conclusion feel inevitable. I called it the Moro Compact, which was possibly self-important of me, but I was the one writing it at 3 a.m. in a borrowed room on an alien station while 2 Vihari dreadnoughts sat outside, so I decided I had earned the small indulgence. Caroline read the final version over my shoulder and said, "The Kolthari are going to argue the precedent." "I know," I said. "What if the Arathi don't come around?" Vreth was unreadable. Vreth was paying very close attention, I said. Unreadable and opposed are not the same thing. And Thesivane. I thought about the High Arbiter. About the careful way they had navigated the hearing. About the shade their membrane had shifted to when I invoked Article 7, a shade the translation system had rendered as silence, but which I suspected was something closer to consideration. Thesivane has been running this council for a very long time, I said. People who run things for a very long time know when something is changing. They know the difference between a problem they can solve and a situation they have to adapt to. And which are we? I looked at the compact on the screen. 12 pages. The future of humanity's role in the galaxy, laid out in plain language. We're the second kind, I said. And I think Thesivane already knows that. At 5 a.m, I set the document, stood up, and went to the viewport. Vethra Station's external lights were cycling into a dim phase that passed for night on its outer ring. The stars beyond the viewport were the same stars I had grown up seeing from Earth, more or less, the same light, just from a different angle. I thought about what Dr. Lane had written in her profile of the Council. They fear what they cannot predict. Make yourself legible only up to the point where legibility becomes limitation. I thought about what that actually meant for tomorrow. Then I went and slept for 4 hours, because the compact was ready and worrying between now and the hearing would not make it better, and I had always found that humans who looked tired in diplomatic chambers were taken less seriously, regardless of what they were saying. The alarm woke me 2 hours before the hearing. I dressed. I made a final review of the compact. I did not eat. I had learned over the years that eating before high-stakes presentations made me feel sluggish, and I needed to be precise. I picked up my data slate. I walked to the chamber. The doors opened, and I walked to the podium, and the 7 members of the Galactic Council looked down at me from their elevated crescent, and I looked back at all of them, and for a moment the chamber was completely still. I had 12 pages and 70 years of unrecorded history and the particular quality of calm that comes from knowing exactly what you believe and being willing to stand in front of the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy and say it plainly. I began. I did not start with an apology. I did not start with a request. I started with a question, the same question I had asked 3 days earlier, and I let it hang in the air for 3 full seconds before I continued. From whom, I said, does the Council propose to protect humanity? And before you answer, let me tell you what humanity has already encountered. I spoke for 11 minutes and 40 seconds. I had timed it in rehearsal. I used no emotional language. I used no descriptions of human valor or human suffering. I used only documented incidents, specific dates, coordinates, outcomes. I used the Council's own intelligence reports when I had them, and Owen Harley's files when I did not, and I made clear which was which. I presented the economic analysis in 3 minutes. Caroline had helped me compress it to its essential logic, which was this: protective designation had never been lifted from any species in 400 years. The Council's current designated species collectively represented the largest concentration of resource extraction contracts on record. The designation system, in practice, functioned as a permanent economic relationship that disproportionately benefited the Council's member species. I did not say this was intentional. I did not need to. The numbers said it. I presented the Morrow Compact in the final 4 minutes. I read it plainly. I made no arguments for it beyond what it contained. When I finished, I set the slate on the podium and looked up. This is not a refusal, I said. It is an offer. Humanity is not asking to be protected. We are asking to be partners. The distinction matters, because one of those arrangements makes the galaxy safer for everyone, and the other one only makes it more comfortable for a few. I stepped back. The chamber was quiet. Then Councillor Vreth of the Orathi spoke. In 30 years of studying galactic politics, Owen Harley had told me the night before, Vreth had spoken first in a full council session exactly twice. Both times, the vote had gone the way Vreth spoke. The Orathi have reviewed the Croth incident records, Vreth said. The voice through the translation system was deep and unhurried. We have had our own intelligence on the Croth withdrawal for some years. We chose not to raise it because we were uncertain of the source. We are no longer uncertain. The Colthery delegate leaned forward. Councillor Vreth, the procedural. The Orathi support the Morrow Compact, Vreth said. The Colthery delegate stopped speaking. One by one, the votes came. The Breck, who had said almost nothing in 3 days, voted in favor quietly and without elaboration. The Lorvani, who I had expected to be the most difficult, surprised me. Their delegate asked 2 precise questions about the compact's terms, received 2 precise answers, and voted in favor on the basis that the arrangement appeared to be genuinely mutual, which was, they said, rare enough to be worth supporting. The Theshan collective voted in favor. High Arbiter Thesavane's membrane moved through a long sequence of shades that the translation system rendered as formal approval, with the additional notation that the Arbiter wished it recorded that the Morrow Compact represented a novel precedent and that its implications would require extended review. The Vihari voted against. So did the Colthery. Their opposition was clear, organized, and entirely expected. The economic logic was obvious. They had the most to lose from a precedent that suggested designated species could renegotiate their status. 4 in favor. 2 opposed. Thesavane's abstention made 5 points of active engagement out of 7, and the compact passed on the majority. I stood at the podium and let the outcome settle over me. Not relief, I had not allowed myself to feel enough anticipatory dread to make relief the appropriate response. Something quieter. Something closer to the feeling of watching a long, careful calculation arrive at the correct answer. The formal announcement took another 20 minutes. Paperwork, recording, the particular ceremonial language that the council required for any change in status. I listened to all of it with the same patient attention I had given everything else over the past 4 days. When it was done, Thesavane looked at me directly. The Morrow Compact will be studied, Thesivane said. Whether it is admired or criticized will depend on how it is implemented. That's true of most agreements, I said. Thesivane's membrane shifted through a shade the translation system did not have a word for. I suspected it was something like agreement with reluctance, which was probably the closest Thesivane ever came to a compliment. I picked up my data slate. I turned and walked to the doors. In the corridor, the Colthery delegate was waiting. I had not expected that. They were a thin individual, as I had noted during the hearing, and they carried themselves with the posture of someone who had been in positions of authority long enough that it had become their default physical state. They looked at me with an expression that was not quite hostile and not quite neutral, something in between. You understand, they said, that you have made this more complicated. I understand that I've made it different, I said. Complicated is a matter of perspective. The Vihari will not forget this. I would be concerned if they did, I said. Selective memory is a poor basis for a working relationship. The Colthery delegate looked at me for another moment. Then they turned and walked away down the corridor without another word. I watched them go. Alan Ford was waiting for me at the docking bay. He had the shuttle ready, the engine warm, a cup of the grain blend sitting in the holder beside the pilot seat. He looked at me when I came aboard and read whatever was in my face. It passed, he said. 4-2, I said. Abstention from Thesivane. He nodded slowly. The Vihari are going to be difficult. Yes, I said. And the Colthery. Them too. So we've got two large, economically motivated, politically influential species who are now officially unhappy with Earth. We've handled worse, I said, and sat down, and picked up the cup. Alan looked at me for one more moment. Then he turned to the controls, ran through the pre-departure sequence, and began guiding us away from Vethra Station's docking arm. The two Vihari dreadnoughts were still out there. They did not move to intercept us. They simply watched as we pulled away, two enormous, patient shapes against the dark, and then they were behind us, growing smaller, until the station and everything around it was just a point of light in the viewport. I leaned back. Outside, the stars were the same ones I had grown up with, seen from a different angle, as they always were. 6 months later, I was standing in front of the Earth Diplomatic Committee, giving my formal report on the Morrow Compact and its first half year of implementation, and somewhere around the 40-minute mark I noticed that 3 of the 7 committee members were looking at me with an expression I had not often seen from senior officials, something between relief and quiet pride. The compact had held. More than held, in fact. Within the first 3 months, the BREC had reached out through formal channels to request a joint survey operation of the outer void nomad corridors. Humanity and BREC scientists had been working together for 6 weeks now, compiling data on nomad movement patterns that the Council's own models had missed entirely because they had been built on incomplete observational records. The corrected model suggested 3 potential incursion corridors that had not previously been flagged. That information was already being distributed to the affected species in the relevant sectors. The Lorvani had gone further. Their delegate, a careful, methodical individual named Councillor Feth, had contacted me directly, not through the Council's formal channels, with a question about human logistical organization during extended operations. It was a technical question, the kind you only ask when you are seriously considering applying the answer. I had spent 2 hours with Feth over a secure channel, walking through how human supply chains worked under pressure, and by the end of the conversation Feth had asked 3 follow-up questions that told me exactly what they were thinking. The Lorvani were looking at their own designated species differently. Not dramatically, not publicly, not yet, but the question had been planted, and questions like that, once planted, tend to grow. The Vihari remained cold. Official communications were handled through intermediaries and were scrupulously correct in their language and entirely empty of anything approaching warmth. I expected this to continue for a long time. The Vihari were not a species that changed posture quickly, and I had taken something from them, not a resource or a territory, but a certainty, a sense that the galaxy's shape was fixed and they understood where everything fit in it. That kind of loss takes years to process. The Colthery were actively working to have the compact's precedent restricted. They had filed 3 procedural challenges with the Council's legal body, arguing that the circumstances of humanity's case were sufficiently unique that the compact should not be considered applicable to other species. I was not particularly worried about this effort, the legal arguments were thin, but I was watching it carefully, because the Colthery were persistent and they had significant resources, and persistence plus resources is always worth watching. Caroline Briggs had been appointed to a permanent advisory role with the diplomatic mission. She had accepted with exactly the minimal enthusiasm of someone who found the work genuinely interesting but considered displays of excitement professionally undignified. Owen Harley had retired again, this time with the recorded history he had spent 30 years compiling officially incorporated into Earth's diplomatic archive. He had sent me a brief note when the transfer was confirmed. It said, "About time." I had also received a personal message from Vale, the young Gahari attaché who had asked me what humans were afraid of. She had been reassigned, transferred to the new Joint Species Intelligence Bureau that the Brek and the Lorvani had proposed as a first practical outcome of the Morrow Compact. It was the first institution of its kind in galactic history. She said in her message, finding it challenging. She said my answer about stagnation had occupied her thoughts for several weeks after our conversation. I have been thinking, she wrote, about what it means to be afraid of being stopped rather than being afraid of what stops you. It is a different orientation toward risk than I was trained to expect. I am still deciding what I think of it. I wrote back and told her that was exactly the right response to have, and that I hoped she would let me know what she decided. I was standing at the viewport in my office on Earth, looking out at a gray afternoon over the city, when the signal came in. It was flagged priority from the Council's Joint Monitoring Network, a designation that had only existed for 4 months, another small outcome of the Compact, a shared early warning system that humanity had proposed and the Brek had helped build. The signal was not a message. It was a data packet. Coordinates, spectral readings, movement analysis. Something detected at the far edge of the Council's mapped space, beyond the Croth boundary, in a region where nothing was supposed to be capable of producing the kind of signature the sensors were showing. Something large. Something that did not match any catalogued species, any known vessel configuration, any previously recorded anomalous phenomenon. The analysis models attached to the packet marked it with a single red designation, unclassified. I looked at the data for a long time. Then I looked at the timestamp on the transmission. The Council's emergency session was being called within 48 hours. I was already listed as an invited participant, not as an observer, not as an interested party, but as a full member of the Joint Response Consultation Panel. Full member. 6 months ago that status had not existed for a human being. 6 months ago I had been sitting in a chamber watching the Council prepare to lock humanity into a gilded arrangement we had not asked for and could not easily have refused. 6 months ago I had asked a single question and watched 7 powerful species realize, with varying degrees of comfort, that they did not have a good answer. I thought about what my grandmother had told me once, when I was a young man still deciding what I wanted to do with my life. She had been a practical woman who said things simply and expected you to carry them without assistance. She had looked at me across a kitchen table and said, "The most useful person in any room is the one who is not afraid of the room." I had been thinking about that for 35 years. I thought I understood it. But I understood it better now, standing in my office on Earth with an unclassified signal from beyond the Croth boundary on my screen and an invitation to the Galactic Council's emergency session sitting in my message queue. The most useful person in any room is the one who is not afraid of the room. We had never needed protecting. We had never been the ones who required a guardian or a guide or a careful arrangement of rules to keep us manageable. We had been moving through the dark for decades, handling what needed to be handled, doing the work that no one had asked us to do because the work needed doing and we were there and we were capable. We had just never been invited to do it openly. I opened the message queue and accepted the Council invitation. Then I opened another channel and called Alan Ford. He picked up on the second signal. "Vethera," he said. "Emergency session," I said. 48 hours. A pause. "The new signal?" "Yes." "Do we know what it is?" "Not yet," I said. "But we're going." "We're going," I said. "Get the shuttle ready. I'll be at the field in 2 hours." "Understood," he said. "There's a fresh batch of the grain blend in the galley. I made it stronger this time." I smiled. "Good." I closed the channel. I looked at the signal data one more time. Whatever was out there beyond the Croth boundary, whatever had produced that signature, it was unknown. It was large. It was unclassified. Every analytical framework the Council had tried to apply to it had returned no result. That was, I had come to understand, exactly the kind of problem that humans were made for. Not because we were fearless. Not because we were reckless or unpredictable in the way the Council's threat assessment had implied. But because we had spent our entire history moving toward things we did not fully understand and figuring them out as we went. Because stagnation was genuinely more frightening to us than the unknown. Because when a question had no answer yet, we did not file it and wait, we went and found the answer. I packed one bag. I put my data slate in it. I put Dr. Lane's profile document in a secondary folder, because I had a feeling I would be reading it again before this was over. I walked out of the office and down to the street and got into the car that would take me to the shuttle field. Above the gray city, the sky was overcast and the light was flat and ordinary, the way it always is on the days that turn out to matter. The galaxy, it turned out, had not needed humanity to be protected. It had needed us to be available. And we had always been very good at showing up.